Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu. Good morning. There's a lot going on in the world right now, and much of it is not very good. Much of it is upsetting. But we're fortunate to have the Buddha Dharma. And the Dharma is a guide to truth, and this can help us through many of these things that are happening right now. We use the word liberation in Buddhism in that our awakening helps liberate ourselves from beliefs, some beliefs that are not true. And this really can help us feel better about ourselves and our life. So by waking up, by seeing truth, we can really free ourselves from these unreliable beliefs that we may have. Now, the Nembutsu is our primary practice, and sometimes there's a confusion as to what that really means. And so I've been suggesting some things to see if we can relate a little better with the Nembutsu. And I've been using some very practical examples because it can be very practical, and Nembutsu can help us in our deepest sense of spirit. But when something happens that is unsettling, I suggested that the first thing we do is stop. And when we stop, we might say the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu. And what that alerts us to is that we may not be seeing the problem as accurately or as true as it might be. And by stopping, we realize that the three poisons of hatred, ignorance, and greed that we have might be clouding our opinion of something. So the first thing is to see if we are balanced before we make a judgment about a situation. And when we do that, we realize that we're only seeing one side of it, that there's probably another side and many sides that we're not seeing. So we can move forward, but we do that with a sense of balance, with a sense of humility. And what we're doing is we're honoring ourselves and what we see, but we're also honoring the other. And so that's what our talk will be about today, the self and the other, and how big we might consider ourselves, the individual or the whole community or the whole world. As we talk today about greed and gratitude, we're going to see if we're really on the right track. And the clue to that is how we feel. And if we feel better, if we feel lighter, if we feel joy, then it means we are on the right track. Now, as I said, many things are happening in June. We have graduations. Unfortunately, because of COVID, many of the students who are graduating from particular schools are not having their traditional events, and that can be upsetting. We celebrate Father's Day. Father's Day should be a very happy day. I remember when my first son was born, I saw him in the nursery that first night, and I was terrified. I saw this little infant and realized that I was responsible for him. And I thought, I wasn't ready. I have to get my act together. And here I am 50 years later, trying to get my act together. And so these things that should be celebrations have a sense of responsibility that goes with it. We have other things happening in June, Juneteenth. This is recognized as the day that the slaves were freed. And this was after the Civil War, when Southerners were not complying with the fact that they had lost the war. So there are many clouded things in our past that we're reminded of in June. We have Greenwood, which happened in Tulsa 100 years ago. And then, of course, we have Black Lives Matter. And I don't know if in 2020, in March or April, we realized that Black Lives Matter actually affected Asians, because we've had this anti-Asian sentiment, and that Black Lives Matter is just a way of saying that we all may be affected by negative thoughts and violence. June 6th is D-Day, the day that the invasion and retaking of Europe happened. So many things were happening. We have gun violence, many upsetting things. And so how can we resolve these things? Of course, the most notable thing right now is the COVID pandemic. And I'll use that as an example as we work our way through this. So how does the Nembutsu help us through this? This is not a wish for something better. It really helps us center ourselves. Now, we know that the three poisons, and I've labeled them hatred, ignorance, and greed, HIG, can be switched to humility, understanding, and gratitude, HUG. and that acronym HUG may symbolize how we see the Nembutsu, that it is like a hug. It just makes us feel better. It may not resolve the situation, but it does cushion some of these negative things that happen to us. And to get a better understanding, I did go into that in more depth in the Tri-Temple seminar, which is a video that you can probably access somewhere. But what we're talking about here in greed and gratitude is that with greed, we're thinking of things that could enhance our life, that we want more, that we want things, and we think that by having more, it will make us happy. And we find that that's not really true. But then the other part, gratitude. Gratitude involves others. We acknowledge that others have given us something, and so we're grateful for that. We might say thank you. So again, this point of ourselves and others and how we relate to that. So I talked last week about holons, Holon. And the reason I bring this up is I think it allows us to see this situation of ourselves and others. A holon is something that can be a unit and complete in itself, but it always is in a larger set. The example I used were atoms, and atoms together make molecules. Molecules may combine, make compounds, and compounds may constitute a tissue. Tissues combine and make organs. Organs, of course, make parts of the body. Now, I'm using this because the self we think is complete, and it is. And yet each person may make a bigger set, and we call these sets something like a family. And families could make a larger set of a community. And these communities can make a city, a state, a country, and many countries make a world. And so we have a choice on how we see ourselves as individuals, as a community, as the world. And this is a reality. And this is where we can kind of look at whether we live our lives from the individual or as a group and how we see ourselves. Let's go through this process of determining whether we take something that's negative from greed and make it positive into gratitude. And let's take the example in COVID of wearing a mask. We wear a mask for biological reasons because this coronavirus is an active aerosol. And so when we wear a mask, although some have said that it's an individual decision, it is really for the other person. And that what we're doing is protecting our possibility of having the virus and passing that on to someone else. Now, in the East, in Japan and so forth, it was very common for many, many decades for people who may have a flu or cold to wear masks, protect others. And so this thought of ourselves as the larger self, as a community, is something that I think Buddhism really puts forward. Now, as an example, instead of thinking ourselves as individuals, there is a custom, I think, in the East, and especially in Japan, that we witness, where people are constantly thinking of the others. And sometimes we have words such as enryo, where we think of the others being served before us. I want to give you an example of something that happened in Japan when we were there getting one of our tokudo. We had a group of Americans at a table, and it was a place like a Denny's in Japan. But anyway, we're sitting there, and one of our people spilled a glass of water, and the waitress came running over, and she had a towel to soak up the water, spilled water. And this waitress did that, and instead of being upset with us, she kept saying, "Oh, I'm sorry," as if she spilled the water. It wasn't her at all. It was one of our people. But this is where, just intuitively, she was acting as though she was part of the problem and cleaned up the water. We were very impressed with that. And so it is this thought of the larger self that makes life harmonious. And so what we receive, and this is the culture of Japan, this is what we spread. Now, I was very fortunate in what I received, because my family was deeply grounded in Buddhism, Shin Buddhism. My grandfather helped start the Wanako Buddhist temple. My father was very supportive of the San Jose Buddhist temple. There were two people, Kei Endo and her brother, who brought my sister and me to what was called Sunday school at the time. And I remember this other lady, Kei Nakashima, brought Tetsuhojo and me to the Pacific seminar in the Solomar when we were in high school. And that was the time that I first heard Dr. Taitetsu Uno, other scholars, Reverend Tsuji, and many other people. And over the years, my mother would kind of adopt or invite young ministers over to our house because San Jose was a Betsuin, and we had many young ministers who had their first assignments there. And so I was able to listen and know many ministers in BCA. And so it was natural that I got all these things. And what they gave me was the virus of Dharma, the Buddha nature. And so with this, it's almost natural that I became a Shin Buddhist minister. It's what we received, and this is what we can also spread. Of course, on the negative side, if we received a negative coronavirus, we might spread that. And yet, if we look and realize that we've received things from others, that we might share that. And so it is just a shifting of what we have received and seeing what positive things we can get from that. Now, all of this may sound good, and I've been saying this often. And again, as I've emphasized, it's just words until it's practiced. And so I really encourage people to try some of these things we've talked about. Now, I have a stationary bicycle. It's in the garage. Does anyone else have one? It hasn't worked very well. I'm not losing that much weight. I'm not getting that much exercise because it's in the garage and I don't use it. I might get a Peloton, which is a very expensive stationary bike, I understand. But if we're not using this, if I don't use this thing, it's not doing me any good. So the Dharma talks that you hear, some of these suggestions are like that stationary bicycle in my garage. If it's not used, if it's not practiced, it may not help us at all. So the Dharma really helps look at life, and whenever we have something negative happen to us, and as I said at the beginning, many things are upsetting to us right now. We can just voice the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu, and try to shift our life. I'll end with this story of a farmer. In Japan, in old Japan, he would get up every morning. He had a small little farm on one side of a large valley, and it was hard work to maintain. But every morning he would wake up, and as the morning sun rose behind him, he would see on the far side of this large valley a house that apparently had a golden wall because the sun would shine off of it. And then he thought, that man over there who owned that house was so wealthy that he might, be able to give me some gold or some money. And so he told his wife that he might go over and take this long trek across this large valley until he, could meet this other wealthy man and ask him if he might give him some money. And she thought that was a good idea. And so one day she prepared a meal for him, some onigiri and tea. And so he started off early in the morning. And as the sun rose behind him, he saw the sun shining and reflecting off the golden walls of this house. Well, it took him at least half a day, and he was only halfway across this valley. So he stopped and ate his lunch, rice balls and a little tea, and he continued on. And it was a long, long valley. And toward the end of the day, he finally reached the other side, and he was starting to climb up the hill toward the house. And finally, he reached going around the last corner, and he was very excited because he realized that he would be at the house and he would ask this wealthy man, to help him out. And just as he got around the corner, he saw this house and his jaw dropped down. And he was so disappointed because what he saw was not a golden wall, but what he saw was an abandoned shack. And there was a window. And what he apparently saw was the morning sun reflecting off this window, and it appeared that it was a golden wall. And so his plan was just destroyed, and he was so sad, he just had to sit on a rock, and he turned and looked toward the house. After a whole day's walk, he saw his house way on the other side of the valley. And he was so dejected, he just didn't know what to do. But at that time, the sun was setting behind him. And when he looked toward his house, he realized that the sun that was setting behind him reflected off a window off of his house. And it appeared that his house had a golden wall. And that was when he realized that what he had was not much, but he was grateful for what he had. He wanted more. He wanted, there was some greed in there, but he realized that he had a nice wife, a couple of kids. He had a little plot of land. He had to work hard, but what he had, he could appreciate. And with that, he put his two hands together and voiced the Nembutsu. And so this is the shift in mind that we hope Nembutsu can bring us. So please join me in putting our two hands together as we constantly remember to voice the Nembutsu throughout our day so that we can see life as it truly is and be grateful for what we have received. Please join me. Gassho, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu, Namo Amida Butsu.